The vast majority of games are in danger of going extinct someday. So what's going on? This is the situation we're in, but the problem is by no means unique to gaming. Books, movies, albums, you name it. Preservation and lost media is an issue all formats grapple with. Back when I lived in Pittsburgh, one of my favorite stores to browse was Jerry's Records. Actual Jerry retired from the store in 2017 and sadly died in 2022, rest in peace, but he must have handed the store off to someone because it's still going strong. Hanging around Jerry's, the one thing that stuck out super quickly for me was just the sheer volume of random shit that they had that simply doesn't exist on tape, CD, or in digital form. Jerry's website says they have over 500,000 records. You could treat Jerry's like a typical record store and swing by to pick up a Pink Floyd or Led Zeppelin album missing from your collection, and basically know for sure they're gonna have whatever you're looking for in stock. But walking around a place like that reminded me that creativity is infinite, and you could no joke spend a lifetime digging through their crates, searching for oddities and hidden gems. Yes, there's a lot of generic stuff to sift through. Much of it seems like there's a good reason why it was never digitized, but there's also a lot of decent and interesting stuff out there waiting to be discovered if anyone were to somehow find it and give a listen. Audio recording and vinyl records pressed for the mass market really picked up steam after World War II ended, but records have been a thing for over 100 years. And whether an album was cut for vinyl, or more recently for CD, there's a lot of reasons why an album wouldn't be digitized or otherwise make it past the format it was originally created for. It could be considered not worth it due to perceived low demand. There might be a rights ownership or contract dispute. The original label that made the record could have gone bankrupt. Or maybe the album was by a local band that got far enough to cut a couple records, but were never picked up by a major label. Then there's just plain old obscurity and becoming forgotten by the collective. Rightly or wrongly, somehow or another, stuff tends to fall through the cracks. Now I'm going to throw a few numbers at you. According to the Library of Congress, less than 10% of pre-World War II audio recordings are commercially available, and a large study done on records pressed from 1948 to 1966 found only 17% had been digitized and made available on CD. If you go back even further for a more extreme example, a 2013 report from the Library of Congress estimated 70% of silent films made between 1912 and 1929 are lost completely. That report's from over 10 years ago. I wonder where that number is now. These movies are like gone, which is the sort of nightmare scenario preservations are looking to avoid for other formats. I can accept that story for legacy formats like silent movies and vinyl records, but I always assumed video games were somehow different. I don't know. They're newer for one, also electronic, and since they're so intertwined with computers, I kind of thought that meant they'd be easier to digitize or something. It's not like an episode of an old school radio drama that was broadcast once in the 50s and evaporated the moment it ended. Video games are tangible. Plus we're smarter now and we can learn lessons from the past. We've learned some lessons. We no longer throw the boxes away immediately like we used to for our N64 and Game Boy games. We've grown tremendously in our sophistication. Shouldn't we be able to sidestep the same preservation issues we've seen with other legacy media? Unfortunately, no. The answer's no. It's not like that at all. Video games are just as set up to disappear as anything else. We're obviously not in a silent movie type situation yet, but for all the ports, remakes, and remasters we're given, the overwhelming majority of games have never been made available on anything other than their original console. About 13% of games released before 2010 are stuck on their original console, to be exact. I would have thought this only applies to older or more obscure titles, but it doesn't turn out to matter when the game was made or what platform it released on. The issue's the same. Did you enjoy Armored Core 6 and thought maybe you'd check out some of the classic games from the series? You better dust off your PS2 because the other 5 games weren't carried forward to PS5, and I don't see them anywhere on the Steam store either. Thinking of trying some of the gems from the GameCube's back library? Better get ready to drop some money on eBay unless you want to be a little filthy nasty pirate. F-Zero GX, stuck. Pokemon Coliseum, 100. XD Gale of Darkness, 200. Mario Party 4, 5, 6, 7. Actually, if you get the Japanese version, it's not so bad. Have you ever wanted to try that Simpsons Hit and Run game everyone's talking about? Simpsons Hit and Run was a console game, but it was ported to PC when it released back in 2003. Good luck getting that port to run on any modern computer. It would probably just be easier to use a PS2 emulator. Same goes for Simpsons Road Rage, wrestling, and skateboarding. All gone. No NBA Jam, no Sonic Advance, no Billy Bob's Huntin' and Fishin', no Bible game either, and the list goes on. I got that 13% number from a research paper published by the Video Game History Foundation and the Software Preservation Network, which I'll leave a link to in the description, and I really recommend to anyone looking for more detail on this. Besides that top-level 13% number, the thing that stuck out for me the most from the report is how consistently bad the situation is across time. No 5-year period from 1960 to 2009 rises above 20% availability, which really surprised me. I would have thought, yeah, sure, maybe ancient stuff from the Atari 2600 or Commodore 64 times is gone now, but surely we don't have this problem today for anything released in my lifetime. Not so. The report found 4.5% game availability for the Commodore 64 library, 5.87% for the Game Boy line, which includes the Game Boy Advance, and just 12% for the PS2. 12%? If only 12% of games from the best-selling console in history have been carried forward to the present day, what hope does the rest of the industry have? It's no single person or company's fault that we're in this mess. It's a deep-rooted issue that happens for a handful of reasons. Some of the reasons are similar to what I mentioned for music, but there's also the added wrinkle that a given game was made on a specific technology that changed or became outdated every few years. For books, paper is paper. For music, the format we listen to has changed, but not nearly as frequently as video game formats change. It turns out being a higher tech medium actually complicates video game preservation efforts. Porting something from one platform to the next is not necessarily some easy automatic thing. If it was, you'd have way more computer games available on Macs. And in general, porting something is actually a bigger ordeal the further back you go. The games themselves are simpler, but the hardware they played on was gnarly and a lot less standardized relative to what you have today. Oh yeah, and if the original source code is lost or otherwise unavailable, which was the case for System Shock 2, you now have a much bigger set of issues. The games industry is newer, it's worth more than music and movies combined, and it shows no signs of slowing down, but it's stuck in the same preservation mess as any other legacy media. No more Simpsons skateboarding unless something changes. So what do? I'll tell you what I do. Buy physical. I've always been a physical game collector guy. Don't get me wrong, I'm not insane. I buy digital if there's a big enough discount happening, and I've got a big Steam backlog that needs serious attention, but if all else is equal, I'll always opt for a physical copy. I bet you know why too. You've heard the debates. You don't actually own Steam games, you know. They have DRM. You can't trade or sell anything you get digitally. You didn't really buy it. It's just a long-term rental. There's truth to all that, but that's not really why I do what I do. I got into physical collecting because I prefer playing on original hardware when possible. That glow of the CRT and all. But there's been less of a reason for me personally as time's gone on. It can be really tough keeping your old hardware alive, and there's always that looming issue of disc rot. Though I find that if you treat your stuff right, it tends to be okay, Xbox 360 Red Ring notwithstanding. I also personally have not had a CRT in a few years, and when I did, how often did I actually sit down to plug everything in? Not as often in practice as I wanted to in my mind. It always just seemed easier to use what was already plugged in, which for me was usually my current gen consoles. So I started physical collecting as an original hardware purist thing, but that's really not what it's about for me anymore. The reason I continue physical collecting, besides the fact that I like looking at my little library stacked up nicely on the cupboard, is that it's my little way of future-proofing myself against lost media, and up till now it's been effective. It doesn't matter if Nintendo pulls backward compatibility, or they take down another eShop, or if my favorite games never make it to Steam. I've got them all right here, ready to go when I am. But wait, collecting physical games was all well and good back in the day, but what's the point now when the full content's not even on the disc anymore? If you need to be online to play, or you need an initial download to get the game to run, doesn't that sort of mean that your so-called physical game is just a glorified download and it guts any advantage you may have had from buying physical? Yeah, for sure. But luckily it's not an issue for most games quite yet. I kind of thought most games don't actually work out of the box anymore, because you seem to find a lot of games that say download required on the case, and there's even more that come with a day one patch. That made me assume there's nothing on the disc and it's unplayable without an update, but according to data on doesitplay.org, you actually can play most games out of the box still. There are totally some that you can't. Example 1, Starfield. Starfield is not playable out of the box because the disc doesn't even come with half the file on it. Example 2, Call of Duty Black Ops 6, which also needs an initial download to run and ups the ante by requiring a persistent online connection, even if you're playing the single player campaign. It's not all like that though. Let's look at what's come out recently. Black Myth Wukong, pass. Astrobot, good. Elden Ring, fine. FF7 Rebirth, Metaphor, all set. And the numbers still look okay in the aggregate. Does It Play tested over 2,000 games, going back from the 90s to the present, and they found 72% are fully playable offline with no download required, and that number goes up to 85% if you include games that might help if you downloaded a patch, but it's not strictly necessary. We make a big deal out of games like Black Ops 6 that will not run whatsoever without an initial download, and that you need to be always online to play because of what they represent, but only 6% of tested games fall in that category. Even if you filter the list for games released since 2020, which is kind of an arbitrary line in the sand when day one downloads seem to have become more of a thing, still 67% are playable offline with no patch, or 83% if you get a suggested, non-necessary patch. They found only 43 games, or 3%, are like Black Ops 6, and there's some multiplayer only ones in there where you'd kind of expect that. I will note that this number would increase substantially if you were talking about PC physical games. Does It Play mostly test console? So maybe collecting physical games is still viable in most cases? Sure, but it's clearly not long-term viable because one way or another, they're going away someday. We're headed towards a digital download-only ecosystem, and it's just a matter of time. There's chart after chart showing what a big chunk of overall sales are digital. I like this one showing spending on physical games has cut in half since 2021 and is down 85% from the max in 2008. Depending on what graph you look at, the numbers for physical versus digital can be a little cooked, and people split hairs over the specifics, because sometimes it'll include money spent on skins in Fortnite and other microtransactions, when what people really just want to see is full game purchases only, but the long-term movement is clearly headed in a certain non-physical direction. We have to prepare for the idea that at some point in the future, we'll be all digital all the time. We've seen certain horror stories of individual games disappearing and entire stores shutting down for good. For games, there's the story of The Crew. The Crew was a full-price $60 racing game by Ubisoft, which required always online. It released in 2014, and in 2024, Ubisoft took it offline, with no refund or possibility for offline play. Can you imagine something like that flying in any other industry? That'd be like if you bought a DVD, and 10 years later, someone from the store showed up at your house to come take it back. Or more to the point, it'd be like if you bought a movie from Apple or Amazon, and 10 years later, it just dropped out of your library. You'd be pissed. We all remember the death of Flappy Bird, but at least there you had a few months to download it, and it stayed on your phone if you did. Then there's entire online storefronts. Steam seems pretty embedded and stable, but if you want anything from the Wii, Wii U, or 3DS eShops, you can't get it because Nintendo closed them. In a bunch of cases, that was the only way to get the games listed there. We don't quite yet have as detailed reporting for games that have fallen off digital storefronts, but the report from before does estimate that about 1,000 of the 2,400 games on the Wii U and 3DS shops were not available on any other platform, including some first-party Nintendo stuff like Dr. Luigi and Mario and Donkey Kong minis on the Move. There's potentially the same problem with games that only exist on Game Pass with no standalone release. What's Microsoft going to do about that down the road? Hard to say. Obviously, there's another option, which may involve theft or the wrath of publishers. I speak, of course, of the cool crime of internet piracy. I don't condone anything illegal, and I like checking this site to figure out if I'm a pirate or not. The community is doing great work keeping games alive that developers have either abandoned or refused to make available, But I wish we had a better answer than telling people to resort to piracy. ROMs exist for basically every game, but legality aside, just because a ROM exists doesn't mean it works flawlessly in today's emulators. It takes a lot of work from the community to get these games up and running right. But in a perfect world, we'd have a smoother path to all this. So what do we do going forward? I'm sorry to say that buying physical is really more like game collecting, and game collecting is not the same thing as game preserving. I'm gonna keep doing it because old habits die hard, and if enough people join me, it'll maybe sort of send a message to the industry that there's still a reason to ship games to Best Buy and Walmart. But buying physical only is not a long-term strategy, and more so doesn't really address the root cause. When we go all digital, it'll be really important to support sites like GOG that offer their games with offline installers and the ability to create backups. GOG has always differentiated themselves by letting you do that, and in 2024, they did us one better by announcing a preservation program where they personally restore and update a growing library of games to work with modern systems. That's updating resolutions, adding controller support where applicable, and even fixing some bugs from the original. It's an awesome program, and there's even a wish list so you can request future games. I hope more online storefronts follow in GOG's footsteps. Developers can help by releasing tools to keep their game online after they don't want to support it officially anymore. If online play is required for a certain game, companies should release a patch to remove that requirement before shutting down their servers for good. Companies can also work with the Library of Congress or with the Video Game History Foundation to submit a final copy of a game to a public archive before they remove it from sale. Developers, of course, can port or emulate their old games. I'm not saying you have to, I get that it takes work, but either do that and make it somehow available, or lay off with the emulation lawsuits. The holy grail is to decriminalize emulation for out-of-print games. Nintendo, Sony, and others aggressively fight emulation, even for games they refuse to sell. Instead of fighting the community, work with them to keep preservation efforts alive. If you want to go after people who are stealing and sharing active, newly released games, I totally get it. But if a game's however many years old and not commercially available anymore, these lawsuits do huge damage to preservation efforts and do more harm than good to a company brand, if you ask me. The last thing you can do is advocate for changes to copyright laws. The main law governing all these copyright measures is the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, or DMCA, which was passed in 1998 and makes it broadly illegal to bypass digital rights management controls. It's broadly illegal, but every 3 years the Library of Congress passes judgment on valid preservation-related exceptions. And while there have been some wins, in 2024, it rejected an exemption that would have allowed video game museums and other similar archives to be able to bypass copyright as to allow games to be made available remotely to researchers, which is a valid exception for other media. The Video Game History Foundation actually just launched an online library with magazines, posters, and art books going back all the way to the 70s. Maybe someday we'll have a similar online library for games too. Modern Vintage Gamer has a great video explaining all this, which I highly recommend if you're looking for more details. You can also support groups like the Electronic Frontier Foundation, EFF, who push for exemptions and other changes to the law that would make game preservation easier to do legally. Do you ever get frustrated that a game you used to love just isn't easily accessible anymore, and it means either resorting to eBay or using an emulator? I think the coolest thing in the world would be that if there were these like new age video game libraries that you could just show up at and play any old game you want. Kind of like how there are libraries where you can show up and watch old TV episodes nobody's ever heard of. There are more and more games coming out these days, and so it'll be easier to fall behind if we don't get efforts like these off the ground. Until then, we're just gonna have to do what we can with what we have. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll talk to you guys soon.